Shalom, my name is Vardit Ringwald, and I would like to welcome you all to today's virtual gathering. As the founding and the current director of the School of Hebrew at Middlebury College in Vermont, I'm honored that our school was invited to take part in this event. Our school was founded in 2008 and became the 10th school to join the prestigious language school at Middlebury College that was founded more than 100 years ago, 105 to be exact. And our school has three main missions. One is to increase the number of people who are proficient in Hebrew by offering 6 levels of modern Hebrew courses and also classical Hebrew courses during the summer and the academic year, using the well-known intensive immersive method created by the school. Our second mission is to professionalize the field of teaching and learning Hebrew as a second language through our MA degree. And also our third mission is to prepare a cadre of researchers through our doctorate program who acquire the tools to advance the field. This series, How to Revive a Dead Language in 100 Years, is organized by the Consulate General of Israel to New England and co-hosted by Brandeis University's Hebrew program, the Zuckermann Center for Israel Studies, the Jewish Studies program at Colby College, Middlebury Language Schools, Hebrew College, and Northeastern University Hillel. First of all, I'm honored to invite Ambassador Meron Reuven, the Consul General of Israel to New England, to share his introductory remarks. Ambassador Reuven has served as the Consul General of Israel to New England since November 2020. During his diplomatic career, spanning over 3 decades, Ambassador Reuven has served in various positions, including roles in the Israeli embassies in Chile and Mexico, and ambassador to Paraguay, Bolivia, and Colombia. Reuven has also served as Israel's ambassador to the UN between 2010 to 2011, and as Israel's Chief of State Protocol from 2015 to 2020. Ambassador Reuven was born in South Africa and made Aliyah from the UK to Israel in 1974, where he studied diplomacy and international relations at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. During his military service, Ambassador Reuven was air traffic controller in the Air Force. Reuven is father to Chen and Liad and partner to David. Please, Ambassador Reuven, bevakasha.
Thank you very much. Shalom and good evening and good morning to all of our friends who are watching us live from around the world through Zoom or Facebook. Welcome back to our inspiring series on the revival of the Hebrew language and its continuous reinvention and evolution. Thank you very much, Verdit, for this introduction and for moderating this event. I would like to thank our partners, some of the leading academic institutions from Massachusetts, Maine, and Vermont, Brandeis University's Hebrew program, the Zuckermann Center for Israel Studies, the Jewish Studies program at Colby College, Middlebury Language Schools, Hebrew College, and Northeastern University Hillel. This fascinating program couldn't have happened without your support and participation. The consulate staff and I are thrilled to be holding such a phenomenal group of speakers who will dissect the story of this sleeping beauty language from surprising perspectives. Gil Chovav, Ghil'ad Zuckerman, Guy Sharet, and Tamar Elam Gindin. I hope that for those of you who have missed the first event, you can get it on our email and on our other ways through the consulate. Toda Rabah. I hope that you will enjoy the second episode of How to Revive a Dead Language in 100 Years. Ech lachyot safa meta b'mea shana. Thank you.
Toda Rabah, Ambassador Reuven. And as a lifelong educator, language educator or Hebrew educator, and one of the leaders of the field in teaching in the field of teaching and learning Hebrew as an additional language, I share a dilemma with many in the profession. What kind of Hebrew do we need to embrace for the standard Hebrew that the Hebrew Language Academy is advocating for, or the spoken Hebrew that native Israelis use? And which would they consider if they wish to conquer the language in order to become active participant in all aspects of life of the Israeli society? In addition, how do we explain the constant dynamic evolution of the language for those who wish to research it? Or Professor Ghil'ad Zuckerman joined to enlighten us on these issues. I know Professor Zuckerman from his fascinating research, but also as one of the scholars who contributes to our Middlebury program. Professor Zuckerman, who earned his PhD, I would say PhDs, right, from both Cambridge and Oxford, is chair of linguistic and endangered languages at the University of Adelaide, Australia. He is a chief investigator in a large research project assessing language revival and mental health, funded by the Australia's National Health Medical Research Council. He's also, it's very important to say that, author of the seminal bestseller, Israelit Safa Yafa, Israeli, a beautiful language, and you would see the cover on the screen soon. He also wrote another book in 2000. This book came out in 2008 and 2003. Ghil'ad published another book which called Language Contact, Lexical Enrichment in Israeli Hebrew. And his latest book, Revivalistics, From Genesis of Israeli to Language Reclamation. This is the book about Israelit Safa Yafa. And then we'll see the cover of the other book soon. And when it gets to the third book, here is the latest book, right? Which is From the Genesis of Israeli Language Reclamation in Australia and beyond. From Israeli to Australia and beyond, and you can see it, and it was published in 2020. You're welcome to write your questions for Professor Zuckerman using the Q&A feature on Zoom, or comment on Facebook Live, and Ghil'ad will be happy to answer them after the presentation. Go ahead, Ghil'ad, בהצלחה, תודה רבה.
Thank you so much, Vardit. Can you hear me? I was in Emdat Mi'ut, but now I unmuted, so I'm not Mi'ut anymore. I would like to thank firstly Vardit Ringwald for the lovely introduction. I would love also to thank Amir Tadmor from the Boston Consulate, and of course Ambassador Meron Reuben, and Hannah, who is the technician or the one who helps the technicalities here. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I was in Boston not long ago, just before COVID, and please let me know if you can see my screen. My screen has a PowerPoint that says, "Do Israelis really speak Hebrew?" Can you see it, Vardit? If you can see, just excellent. I decided, together with Amir and Vardit, to entitle this talk, "Do Israelis really speak Hebrew?" and to add some controversial spice to this wonderful series, the 4-lecture series with great friends of mine. In fact, I know all of them, Gil Chovav and Tamar Gindin Eilam, and also Guy Sharet, and it's a pleasure to be part of it. 7 Jews have changed the world. Moses said, everything is in the head. Jesus said, everything is in the heart. Mark said, everything is in the stomach. Freud said, everything is in the loins. Zuckerman, that's me, said everything is in the tongue. Zuckerberg, another sugar daddy, said everything is in the finger. But the cleverest Jew of all said everything is relative. And the success of language revival is relative. No language reclamation, no reclamation of a sleeping beauty, as the ambassador beautifully said, can be fully successful. It is simply impossible to reclaim a language without cross-fertilization, without hybridization with a revivalist's mother tongues. As an eighth Jew said, not that there is anything wrong with that. This is, of course, Jerry Seinfeld. This is Pink Floyd for you, modeled upon Pink Floyd. So what is the Hebrew language? I'm just giving a little bit of background about the Hebrew language as opposed to the language that we will talk about today, the Israeli language. As you can see, the Hebrew language comes from Canaanite, which comes from Northwest Semitic, which comes from Central Semitic, which comes from West Semitic, which comes from Proto-Semitic, which comes from Afro-Asiatic. This is why, for example, Hebrew is related not only to Arabic, not only to Aramaic, the language of Jesus, but also to Somali, for example, which is a Cushitic language under Afro-Asiatic, also to Berber, to Egyptian, to Omotic, and to other languages. This is the Stammbaum model or the family tree model. Hebrew is currently the only official language of the State of Israel, which, as you all know, was established in 1948, although Hebrew, in quotation marks, is from the fin de siècle, from the end of the 19th century. It is spoken to varying degrees of fluency by Israel's 9.5 almost million citizens, as a mother tongue by most Jews, whose total number is 7 million, and as a second language by Muslims, Arabic speakers, Christians, Russian or Arabic speakers, Druze, Arabic speakers, and others. During the past century, what I call Israeli, somewhat misleadingly also known as modern Hebrew, and I will explain exactly that in the talk today, why I say somewhat misleadingly, has become the primary mode of communication in all domains of public and private life. And I would probably add that, in my humble opinion, Israeli is actually the main unifying characteristic or bonding characteristic of the Israeli citizens, who unfortunately more and more seem to share only this beautiful language, Israeli. And I would also argue that Israeli is definitely at the top achievements of Zionism in the fin de siècle and the beginning of the 20th century. The main question that I would like to address today is, do Israelis really speak Hebrew? And for that, I need to discuss the origins of this beautiful language. And I'm going to do it, I'm going to start with the Hegelian dialectic, which comes from Fichte, Johann Gottlieb Fichte. I'm sure that many of you have heard of these terms: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. This will explain to you how I came up with a synthesis as opposed to the thesis and the antithesis. But what is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis? Let me start with music in the United States of America. I know we have many listeners from America today, because this is organized by Boston, but we also have many other people from all over the world. Let's start with America. At the beginning of the 20th century, the thesis when it comes to music is classical music. Classical music is orderly, it's harmonious, it is played by white people. I'm talking about pianists and violinists, many Jews, by the way, playing Mozart and Beethoven and singing Verdi and Puccini. This is classical music. This is the thesis. Then comes the antithesis. The antithesis is the blues. The blues is initially disharmonious to the white ear. It's improvising, which is an abomination to classical music at the time, or the 20th century I'm talking about. It is black. It's played by African Americans, and it's also played by the other side of the railway. And when I say improvisation, you can take like a book and you start doing, and then somebody comes with a spoon, and this is the antithesis, the opposite of the classical music. And then, and this is the point that I would like to say now, comes the synthesis. And the synthesis, simplifyingly, is what most of us listen to today. This is the pop and the rock. If you look at Elvis Presley, if you look at Michael Jackson, if you look at the Beatles, they actually synthesize between classical music, the harmonious one, and the more kind of cool, groovy blues. And the result is a synthesis. Pop did not exist prior to this synthesis. Now, this is how music developed at the beginning of the 20th century in America. Let me now turn into the development of ideas when it comes to the Israeli language. Where does this language come from? Where does a language that is my mother tongue and the language that is Vardit's mother tongue, where does this language come from? Let's begin with a thesis. The thesis is the traditional view that Israeli is simply Hebrew, and this is what many people believe. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of Khalfon Hill Doesn't Answer. It's a beautiful film in Israel when the officer asks the soldier, what do you do if the Egyptians are approaching the post? Oh, what we did in 56. And what did you do in 56, 1956? There was a war, of course. Oh, whatever we did in 48. You can't beat that, can you? And what did you do in 48? This is the first war of Israel as a state. Well, 30 years, who remembers? Sometimes when I read linguists who write about their thesis, they say, oh, as Ben Chaim said, of course, and Ben Chaim said, as this one said, so it's kind of an axiom that goes kind of transgenerationally. This is the thesis. The thesis is that Israeli is a result of revival, full revival, and this is Hebrew. The antithesis argues the opposite side, and there was Gotthelf Bergstresser in 1928, may God help him. He says about the Israeli, my term, that he heard in Israel. He visited Israel. He was a German, of course. He said about it, ein Hebräisch, das in Wirklichkeit eine europäische Sprache in durchsichtige hebräische Verkleidung ist, mit gemeineuropäischen Zügen und einzelsprachlichen Besonderheiten, aber nur ganz äußerlich hebräischem Charakter. In other words, some of you know German, a Hebrew which in reality is a European language in transparent Hebrew disguise, with characteristics of standard average European and with peculiarities of specific European languages, but with only totally external Hebrew character. In other words, what he says is similar to Katzenelson, not Ber Katzenelson, but Kalman Katzenelson, who says in Israeli, Leshon habasis היא יידיש, ועברית היא שפת עזר, שכל המתבטא בה מוקרן אליה מן היידיש. The base language is Yiddish, and Hebrew is a language of assistance that all that is expressed in it projected from Yiddish. So in simplification terms, or simplifyingly, what they say is that Israeli is Yiddish with Hebrew words. And this is what Katzenelson says. I will read it in the English. You can see it here we speak Yiddish, Russian, Arabic, and English in Hebrew words. And since of all the tongues spoken by the Jew, Yiddish is the greatest, it leaves its trace on our Hebrew speech and determines a uniform form for it. The success of spoken Hebrew is not its own success, but rather the success of Yiddish, which in some way took control over it and enslaved it, much as the Yiddish-speaking Jews took control of all the other Jews of the state and put them into the various frameworks that they have created. As you know, Ashkenazim, like Zuckerman is an Ashkenazic name, Zuckerberg is an Ashkenazic surname. Ashkenazim were the first to arrive in Israel as in their masses, and they indeed, as Kalman Katzenelson says, determined the nature of Israel. And there is a funny story about a guy whose name was Abarjil, which is a Moroccan name, and he changed his name to Berkovich. And then after several years, he changed his name to Barak, like Ehud Barak or Aharon Barak, you know, lightning. And he was asked, why did you change your name from Abarjil to Berkovich and then to Barak? And he said, that was like 50 years ago, well, you know, in Israel, they always ask you, what was your surname before that? So I said Berkovich, so he's an Ashkenazi. So this is just a funny story that tells you that there was some kind of, if you want, belittling of Mizrahi culture. Now, that was the antithesis. I would like now to show you the synthesis that I came up with in this book that is called Israelit Safa Yafa, as Vardit mentioned earlier. I came up with this synthesis, which practically says the thesis is wrong. The antithesis or the antithesis is also wrong. Why? Because both the thesis and the antithesis are monoparental. They argue that Israeli, my term, is either based on Hebrew tout court only or on Yiddish tout court. This is especially Paul Wexler, my teacher from Tel Aviv University, Yiddish relaxified, in other words, Yiddish with Hebrew words. But what I am arguing in my synthesis, which is extremely systematic and linguistically kind of advanced, so to speak, is that Israeli at the same time is based on two major contributors, Yiddish and Hebrew. Yiddish is the subconscious contributor to the emerging language called Israeli, and Hebrew is a conscious contributor. I believe in a hybrid vigor. It's a little bit Jungian if you do psychology about the conscious and the subconscious. And then you have many other languages influencing Israeli, like Judeo-Spanish, Ladino, a little bit Arabic, a lot of curses. When you curse in Israeli, you usually use Arabisms. You don't use Hebraisms. You don't say Ben Avat Hamardut or Tol Korami Ben Ainecha. You use an Arabic kind of vulgarism. Russian, Polish, German, English, Italian, French, many other contributors. I told Stephen Fry, and I will show you a bit of that interview. I told him that part I will not show you, that Israeli on the one hand is a phoenix, and you can see here phoenix rising from the ashes, that's Hebrew. On the other hand, it's a cuckoo laying its eggs in another bird, in another nest, tricking the other birds to believe that this is its own offspring. This is a cuckoo. You know, cuckoo is kind of crazy, also in Israeli, cuckoo. And on the other hand, it's a magpie. You know, it's a like gazzaladra in Italian. It steals from American, as you will see in the clip with Stephen Fry. It steals from Arabic. It steals from Russian, etc. So it's a rara avis. It's a rare bird, tzipor nedira, we say in Israeli, which is a phoenicuckoo cross with some magpie characteristics. This is Eliezer Ben Yehuda. He's a main Hebrew revivalist. Of course, he was not on his own. There were Bialik, etc. We listened to Gil Chovav last week, who is the great-grandson of Eliezer ben Yehuda. And this on the right is Eliezer ben Yehuda too, who lives in sometimes Jerusalem, sometimes America, I think Florida. And his name is Eliezer ben Yehuda, and he is the grandson. So he is one generation above Gil Chovav. And what is funny is that this journalist, Karmit Sapir-Weitz, she invited us to kind of fight, but we ended up being very close friends, so you can see it in the photo. Now, this is the phoenicuckoo cross with some magpie characteristics. I now would like to continue and to explain why the synthesis, according to which Israeli is a hybrid language, is correct, and why the thesis and the antithesis are incorrect. And for that, I would like to introduce you to two important principles. The first principle is the congruence principle, and the second principle is the founder principle. Let's begin with the congruence principle, and don't be deterred by the term congruence that might not be fathomable for a non-native speaker, and maybe for some native speakers of English. The congruence principle argues that the more contributing languages a feature exists in, and a feature can be, for example, the word order, whether it's subject, verb, object, or verb, subject, object in a sentence, the more likely it is to persist in the emerging language inadvertently, regardless of whether or not the revivalists wanted it. For example, in Hebrew, the syllable structure, as in Israeli we say mivneh havara, was consonant, vowel, something, something. You could never have a syllable only with a vowel. In Israeli, it's not a problem. When I say ze or ze, this or this, the o is just a vowel. There is no consonant there. In Hebrew, as opposed to Israeli, I should have said ze o with a glottal with a, this that does not really exist in Israeli as much. Of course, it exists in Hebrew. So in Hebrew, when people said, I love you, or when it was a masculine saying to a feminine, ani oheb otah. Yeah, so you have this, but in Israeli, ani ohev otah, there is nothing there. Bear in mind another thing. The Israeli syllable structure loves clusters. I can say tzitza. Tzitza means meatball. In Hebrew, I should have said so. I cannot say tzitza. I can say shrimp with no problem. I can say shtungul. In Hebrew, I should have said ashtrun gul, like istadion for stadium or stadium. I said Platon for Plato. Nowadays, I say plastic, no problem whatsoever. So the syllable structure of Israeli is based on Yiddish, Polish, Russian, and other European languages because they were the ones that were in the many. So the more contributing languages a feature exists in, for example, clusters like shrimp, strungul, the more likely it is to persist in the emerging tongue. The same with Esel Shekel. Esel Shekel is considered by Yossi Sarid, Zichrono Livracha, by Avshalom Kor, Sheyibadel Chaim Arukim, and also by our dear friend Gil Chovav, and other kind of language hygienicists, or whatever you want to call them, as an abomination. Esel Shekel, you should say Asara Shekalim. No, in Israeli, Esel Shekel is grammatical, no problem whatsoever. Patish 5 kilo, which means a hammer 5 kilograms. This is in the army. You have patish 5 kilo, patish 10 kilo, etc. You don't need to say patish 5 kilogramim, yeah, because Israeli takes this characteristic not from Hebrew in this case, but from Yiddish, in which there is no distinction between tsen and tsene. Tsen means 10, and tsene should have meant like 10 feminine. There is no such thing. In Hebrew, there was such a horrible thing in which you put the numeral, which is feminine, like asara. You can see the which is feminine, of course. Don't let the teachers confuse you. They tell you that asara is masculine. Absolutely not. It's feminine, like asir, prisoner, asira, female prisoner, ashir, rich man, like Sheldon Adelson, Zichrono Livracha, ashira, a rich woman. And then you have eser, masculine, 10, asara, 10, feminine. But you had this horrible phenomenon of polarity of gender in which you put asara, which is feminine, with shetalim, which is masculine, asara, yeladim, etc. There are many theories about why, and one of them is that this is in order not to bring the bad eye. So, for example, when you go to the synagogue, you will see the rabbi not counting Chach Shtayim Shalosh, but rather saying Hoshia et Amecha uvarech et nachalatecha ure'em unsem ad olam, and if he reaches olam, he knows there is minyan. There are 10 people. Why does a rabbi not count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? Because there is this superstition, as you know, religions are full of superstitions, that if you count like that, maybe something bad will happen. And you can read about it in the Bible with David counting the soldiers, etc. So maybe we'll count the soldiers as if they're female, and then nothing will happen to them. Now, the reason why Esed Shekel is grammatical in Israeli is because Israeli grammar is not based only on Hebrew, but as I said earlier, it is based on the congruence principle. The more contributing languages a feature exists in this case, there is no feature of polarity of gender in Yiddish, Polish, Russian, etc., the more likely it is to persist in the emerging language. Another example is in most contributing languages to Israeli, and unlike in Hebrew, there are no pharyngeal consonants. No no ta, no fa, no ta, no sa. The result is pharyngeal consonants are not pronounced in Hebrew. They're pronounced in Hebrew, but not in Israeli. So in Israeli, my name is not Ghil'ad, but rather Ghil'ad, just like Julia Ghil'ad. Okay, I would like now to move on to the other principle, which is the founder principle. I know that our time is limited, and I would urge you to ask me questions if you would like me to elaborate on anything. The founder principle says the revivalists' mother tongues are the primary contributors to the emerging language, even if the revivalists do not want it to be. And in the particular case of Israeli, Yiddish is a primary contributor to Israeli because it was the mother tongue of the vast majority of revivalists and first pioneers in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, at the critical, and I repeat, critical period of the beginning of Israeli. And now listen carefully. This is very controversial, but I am totally certain about what I'm saying. Had the Moroccan Jews arrived in Israel first, as opposed to 1950s, had Ben Yehuda, born Perelman, been an Abargel, as I mentioned earlier, Abargel, Berkovich, etc., Israeli, the language that would have been my mother tongue, would have been a totally different language, much more Semitic, because it would have been influenced more by Arabic. So, for example, the word order of biblical Hebrew was verb, subject, object. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, said God to Moses. But in Yiddish, it's subject, verb, object, just like English. In Israeli, it's subject, verb, object. If I say to an Israeli, Avanim shachaku mayim, they will think the stones eroded the water. Of course, I know semantically that it cannot be. It's the water that eroded the stones. But Avanim shachaku mayim in Israeli, that is what it means. When it comes to phonetics, I've mentioned the neutralization of ta, 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 but the ra is amazing. So ra is something that existed in Hebrew, but as you know, most Israelis, they say re, like arba. Arba means four, and abba means daddy. Arba and abba you cannot really distinguish between them, and therefore there is a commercial in Israel, Abba B'mea, you know, the child does not know Alba for or Abba, which means daddy. The Resh, which comes from Yiddish and from German, etc., not from French, it's different from French, is a characteristic of Israeli. But what is topsy-turvy is that in My Fair Lady, which is that beautiful, politically incorrect, of course, which is why it is even more beautiful, musical, there is the Rhine in spine, sties money in the pline. And Professor Higgins teaches Eliza to say the rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain, like Meron Reuben's accent, the ambassador's accent. I noticed his accent was British, English. What happened in the translation into Israeli? It is translated as Barad Yarad Bidron Sfarad Ha'erev. So hail fell in southern Spain this evening. The only problem is that at the end of the show, the child asks one of the linguists who attended it, Abba, why did Professor Higgins try to teach Eliza to speak like our cleaning lady? And the reason is that in Israel, the ones who pronounce the R properly were actually from North Africa, not only the Russian migrants or the Italian migrants like my own father, who had this R as in Ferrari, but most of them were the Moroccans, etc. And it's topsy-turvy because, of course, in England, when Higgins teaches Eliza to speak like a lady, he teaches her to speak like an Oxonian, like a Cantabrigian, like the upper society, whereas in Israel, it's exactly the opposite. The Ashkenazic elite says, do as we say, don't do as we pronounce it like the Arabs. The Arabs, in fact, were the enviable Semitic pronouncers that Eliezer ben Yehuda saw as his model. The Arab, and I'm talking about the fin de siècle, was the enemy on the one hand and the enviable Semite on the other. Eliezer ben Yehuda wanted the Jew, the new Jew, to come and to say Ghil'ad and etc. But of course, he could not succeed because the revivalists were all Yiddish speakers. Concluding remarks. Language is an archaeological vehicle, full of the remnants of dead and living pasts, lost and buried civilizations and technologies. The language we speak is a whole palimpsest of human effort and history. And you cannot erase the more recent history, Jewish history, from Israeli in search of biblical ancientness. Of course, Zionism is based on the negation of diaspora, the negation of religion, but it actually failed. The negation of diaspora. Despite their European mindset, the revivalists, most of them native Yiddish speaking, wish to speak Hebrew with Semitic grammar and pronunciation like Arabs, as I've just said. But their attempt to deny their more recent roots in search of biblical ancientness, to negate diasporism and disown the weak, persecuted, exilic Jew from public memory, and avoid hybridity as reflected in Slavonicized, Roman Semitic influence, Germanic Yiddish itself, which they regarded as jargon. Jargon is kind of bad, failed. Thus, the study of Israeli offers a unique insight into the dynamics between language and culture in general, and in particular, into the role of language as a source of collective self-perception. Linguists and community leaders, and there are many such people, seeking to apply the lessons of Israeli in the hope of reviving no longer spoken languages or sleeping beauties or dreaming beauties, which is a wonderful cause. I am a revivalist, a language revivalist. This is what I do in Australia. Should be realistic rather than heuristic. They should not correct the native speakers because the native speakers never make mistakes. The native speaker is always right. Coev li abeten, hurts me the stomach is correct in Israeli, although there is a disagreement between koev, masculine, and abeten, which is feminine. Under the current technological phase, when one revives a language successfully, one should expect to end up with a hybrid. Israeli is a hybridic Eurasian language, both Semitic and Indo-European. You can call it whatever you want, Hebrew, Georgian, whatever. However, you should acknowledge and celebrate its complexity. At this point, probably I should end with this beautiful sign. If your language is endangered, do not allow it to fall asleep. If your language falls asleep, and by the way, I'm talking about people here who come from Ladino background, Yiddish secular background. If your language falls asleep, stop, revive, survive. This is the sign that I found in Australia along the road. And if you revive a language, embrace the hybridity of the children's emerging tongue. And this is the main point today. Do Israelis really speak Hebrew? No, Israelis speak Israeli. They do not understand Hebrew, and probably in another lecture in the future, I will show you how Israelis misunderstand the Hebrew Bible without even realizing that they misunderstand the Hebrew Bible. Thank you so much.
תודה רבה, Ghil'ad. Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. I would like to move quickly. We have a few minutes to go over some of the questions. So if you talked about the Bible, one of the participants asked, well, according to her, children in Israel can understand the Bible. So it doesn't really, I mean, so if you can elaborate on your last sentence statement, it would be.
Okay. So look, it makes me laugh without any malice. I mean, it's, look, let's begin. בראשית ברא אלוהים את השמיים ואת הארץ, והארץ הייתה תוהו ובוהו וחושך על פני תהום. Let's see if Israelis understand it. First question, Bereshit. There is something very, very problematic with Bereshit. The question is, Bereshit of what? At the beginning of what? Because Bereshit means in the beginning of. It is not Bareshit, it is Bereshit. Now, it's true that vocalization or Nikud came 1,500 years after the codification of the Hebrew Bible, and maybe you might argue they made a mistake. I mean, the Bible, of course, is full of mistakes. By the way, the first atheists were linguists. They said, oh, look, there is a mistake here. This one was written by a different person. This is how atheism came about. But coming back to the question, Bereshit of what? We don't know. And Israelis do not even ask this question. If I ask Israelis, what is Shamayim va'aretz? They say, oh, it means sky and earth. Absolutely not. Shamayim va'aretz in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, in Hebrew, does not mean sky and earth, unlike what Israelis believe. Shamayim va'aretz is a merism. Merism means it's an expression that uses the extremes to refer to the whole. For example, when I say zaken wataf, which means old people and babies, it does not mean old people and babies. It means all people. So babies, 20 years old, 30 years old, 49 years old, etc., etc. When I say b'shivtecha u'kumecha, I don't mean when you sit and when you stand up. I mean always, in all your activities. When I say in Australia, Pam and Nyunga family, I don't mean Pam and Nyunga. I mean Pam and Nyunga and all in between. Shamayim va'aretz in the Bible does not mean heaven and earth. It means world. So why did they not write bara et ha'olam? Because olam in the Bible does not mean world. It means netzach or eternity. So Israelis who read the Bible and see olam, they might think of the world, but actually it means eternity. I know people who participated as examiners in the Hidon Tanakh, which is the Bible quiz in Israel, and they wrongly thought that Tov Vavohu means balagan, mess, chaos, a lot of things. Actually, Tov Vavohu in Hebrew means the opposite of balagan, the opposite of mess. It means Metz as in M-E-S-S, the opposite. It means nothing and nothing. So tovavo means you have nothing to make balagan with. And this is exactly the opposite of how Israelis understand it. Most children I ask tehom, they tell me it means abyss. You know, tehom, you arrive in Mitzpeh Ramon, there is a tehom. No, tehom means water. Now, this is just the first sentence in the Bible. I can assure you, Israelis not only do not understand the Bible, much, much worse. They believe they understand the Bible without realizing that they do not understand the Bible. So it's much worse than, say, a Spanish person who does not even read the alphabet, the Aleph, Bet, Gimel. He doesn't say, I don't understand anything, I need a translation. But an Israeli says, oh, I don't need a translation, it's written in Hebrew, and this is my language. Absolutely a fallacy.
So what you're saying is that in order to read the Bible, we need to study Hebrew. This is the conclusion, isn't it? Exactly.
By the way, I studied Hebrew for 11 years, you know, like, and also maybe the person who asked these questions studied Hebrew in Israel, I don't know, or maybe she studied Hebrew, or he studied Hebrew in America. I have no idea. The point of the matter is Hebrew should be studied. I'm not against Hebrew. I love Hebrew. I love Hebrew. I think Israelit Safa Yafa is really a beautiful language, but I also think Hebrew is a beautiful language. But we should not tell the students in America who come to our universities or to our language centers or JCCs, etc., come, you are African American, you want to be, you're a Christian, you want to read the Bible, you're a Jewish, you want to go to Israel to find maybe a spouse or whatever, come together, I will teach you Hebrew as en bloc. No, this is Hebrew and this is Israeli. When I was professor in Miami, I was a visiting professor in Miami. I had, on the one hand, fundamental Christians, many African Americans, who wanted to read Isaiah, and on the like Isaiah, when you write about Alma, is it a Parthenos? Is it a virgin? Is it just a maiden, a young woman? I mean, because all Christians believe that Mary was a virgin. Of course, it's a misunderstanding of the word Alma from Isaiah. So they wanted to come and to learn about Alma. But the Jews wanted to go to Israel and to have fun, and they wanted to say, "Hey, manishma." No, so how can I teach both Hebrew and Israeli in the same class?
Thank you. Yeah. So there's another question about the relationship between Hebrew and Yiddish. So the perception is that actually Yiddish borrowed from Hebrew. There are many words in Yiddish that are Hebrew words like machshefa, machashufe, right? Or balebuste and so on. So can you elaborate more about this? Yeah.
It's very funny because I've just been to, I woke up very early today because here it's morning. And I was hungry. I went to a restaurant called Balabusta. And the reason I went to this restaurant, it's in Adelaide, because we are very famous in wine. And Balabusta, I went there because I thought it was an Eastern European Yiddish Jewish restaurant, and I wanted to check whether they have gefilte fish or whatever. It turned out to be a Lebanese restaurant owned by a Muslim and a Christian and a Druze, Lebanese, etc. The best restaurant in Adelaide. So I go there a lot. I've just had a discussion with my Arab friends there, etc. So Balabusta, true, Baal Habayit, and then you have the te at the end, which is Slavonic. So balebos, te. Te is the feminine that comes from Slavonic languages, Slavic languages like Serbian, Polish, etc. Manishma, as I said in the, there was a video to promote, it comes from Vosertzach, but actually Vosertzach in Yiddish, which means what's third and how are you, is a replication of Slavonic, like Tsotswichach in Polish, Stoslichna, Chese Aude in Romanian, which is a Slavonicized language as well, although it is like Italian, but it was Slavonicized. In Italian, you cannot say che ti senti or che senti, like what do you hear? How, or che si sente, that means how are you? You need to say come va, etc. In German, you cannot say was hört sich, which means what's up. It only means what's heard. It doesn't mean how are you, like manishma. And then you have Georgian, which was influenced as well by Slavonic languages like Ra'ismis, etc. So Yiddish, if I come back to the question, is a fascinating language that, it's true, continues Hebrew and Aramaic, as a substratum. However, Yiddish mostly is a Germanic language which evolved in Baden-Württemberg or Bayern in the 10th, 11th century, when Jews from Italy and France moved up, and therefore they spoke Latin or kind of Old Italian or whatever you want to call it. So for example, in Yiddish, when I want to say, let us say the benediction, Lomir Benchen. Benchen is benediction, benedicere. And when I want to say, let us read the Bible, leggere, in Lomir Lionen. Lionen is leggere in Italian, leggere, oriente for the same as gentile. Davenen. Davenen is to pray. It's like davinare or divinare, not only from dabab or dabar. So this is a phonosemantic, it's a convergence. So Yiddish is, if you want, a Germanic language based on Mittelhochdeutsch or Althochdeutsch, so Old High German, Middle High German, with Latin, Hebrew, and Aramaic substrata, and therefore we say, do you speak, redst du auf Yiddish? Avade, bevadai, ashayle, ezo sheela, atashe, ezo kushia. You know, so of course there is a lot of Hebrew. However, what happens in the pandemic, I'm not talking about COVID-19, I'm talking about the bubonic plague of 1349, Jews are unfortunately, there is a lot of anti-Semitism against them, and they have to escape from Germany to Poland and to other places. And this is when Yiddish undergoes Slavonization. And this is why we say in Yiddish, hoch, which means despite. We say chikave, which means curious. We say voserzach, as I said earlier. So in other words, the Yiddish that influenced Israeli was mostly a Slavonicized Germanic language. Of course, it has Pashtuenai from the Bible, Sizmir finster geworden in die Augen, and now I say Niyali choshech ba'inayim. So in Israeli, you have Chashtuenai, which is like very kind of highfalutin, Chashtuenai. You know, who says Chashtuenai? Maybe if you're a teacher or something. But then you have Niyali choshech ba'inayim, which comes from Yiddish. And you have Meshuga in the Bible, then you got Meshuga from ganzen Kopf, and then you say Meshugal Kol HaRosh. So absolutely, there is often Hebrew, Yiddish, and then Israeli, and this is the beauty. Tachat in the Bible does not mean poches, it doesn't mean bum, it means under, you know, but then of course, eventually it comes as tuches to Israeli, and tachat. Tachat nowadays we can call our buttocks, bottom, tachat. Yeah, it comes from Yiddish, which comes from Hebrew, etc. So Yiddish, of course, has a lot of Hebrew, but it is much more the case that Israeli has a lot of Yiddish. If you want, Israeli is not Retzach Yiddish or the murder of Yiddish, but rather Yiddish Retzach, or Yiddish speaks itself beneath the Israeli language. Yiddish Retzach.
Thank you very much. Ghil'ad, you got a lot of comments and a lot of questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer all these questions and wonderful comments. I'm sure that when you go to the Facebook, you'll be able to answer the question and react to the comments. So we will stop here for now. And I would like to thank you all. First of all, to thank you, Ghil'ad, for again, for answering all these questions. And to thank you all for participating in the second event of how to revive dead language in 100 years. The next program, Text and the City, Learning Hebrew in the Street, presented by Guy Sharet and hosted by the Schusterman Center for Israeli Studies, will take place in January 21st at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you all again, and thank you again to the Israeli Consulate in Boston and our academic partners for hosting these fascinating events. Shalom to all of you. Keep safe and Happy New Year to all of you. Toda Ghil'ad, toda to all of you. Thank you.